Rapidly running out of time, Christian radio talk show host and apologist Bob Dutko gives his 8th proof for God's existence.
The number 8 proof for God's existence are non-physical human characteristics.
For example, human emotion. Emotions such as love, hate, jealousy, premeditation, pride. You have to ask yourself, if there is no God, and we are nothing more than mutated beings that have gradually evolved and mutated from primordial goo, how is it that we have such a consistency throughout humanity of feelings of love, hate, jealousy, pride, premeditation? Where do these emotions come from? What is the source? How do emotions evolve? And how is it that all humans, by and large, experience these very same emotions? There is no evolutionary model for that. It seems to me the logical thing to conclude is that they must have come from God.
How is it we have such a consistency throughout humanity of a backbone? 2 arms, 2 legs, 5 fingers. Where do they come from? How do these physical characteristics evolve? Well, of course, we know how. And we also know that emotions are as much a part of humanity's evolutionary history as was the acquisition of a backbone and bipedalism. Contrary to the apologist's implication, emotions are not merely a human trait. Emotions are shared across species by many other animals. Consider fear. Consider love, which really is a strong emotional tie to another person. Obviously, animals must share something similar to the emotion of love. They too have strong emotional ties to others. Anyone who spends any time with animals knows they have emotions, because we can read their cues. Paul Bloom, professor in the Department of Psychology at Yale University, explains in an online lecture the role of emotions in our evolutionary history. Without emotions, human life would not have evolved very far.
Emotions set goals and establish priorities. And without them, you wouldn't do anything. You couldn't do anything. Your desire to come to class, to study, to go out with friends, to read a book, to raise a family, to do anything, are priorities set by your emotions. Life would be impossible without those emotions.
What we're afraid of can give us clues into our evolutionary past, showing us how emotions played a role in our survival.
We're afraid of spiders, snakes, heights, storms, large animals, darkness, blood, strangers, humiliation, deep water, and leaving home alone. I mean, you're afraid of other things too. But those are big things to be afraid of. I'm not even going to ask. If there's somebody who in this room who's not afraid of any of those things, you're a tougher person than I am. I mean, these are universal fear elicitors. Why? What do they have in common? Why would you be afraid of those things? And the answer is, and why are there so few people afraid of guns, cars, and electrical outlets? The answer is not particularly surprising. These are things that, it's ticking over there. These are things that are scary in our ancestral environment. More particularly, these are things that through the course of human evolution have been dangerous to us. And so we're afraid of these things and not so afraid of these things.
But of course, humans are not the only animals to have evolved the emotion of fear. And research shows fear is an emotion with a deep evolutionary history.
So chimpanzees are afraid of certain things, and they could often develop phobias for certain things. But the phobias they develop, the fears they develop, are things like spiders and snakes. There was a nice study done in urban Chicago, in the inner city of Chicago, and they asked children raised in the inner city, what are you most afraid of? And you might think they would say, I'm afraid of being shot. I'm afraid of guns. I'm afraid of being killed by somebody or being harmed by somebody. I'm afraid of being run over by a car. The 2 biggest fears of children in urban Chicago are that, snakes, and spiders. Even though many of these children had probably never seen a snake outside of a zoo in their lives. These are natural fears. There's some research done by the psychologist Judy Deloach at University of Virginia, where she's studying babies' fears of spiders and snakes. Babies, obviously, who, since their parents are normal, have not yet seen spiders and snakes. There are various ethical reasons why you can't show babies. You can't try to construct phobias in babies of spiders and snakes. But the research she's finding using more indirect methods finds, as one would expect, these are what psychologists would call prepotent stimuli. That is, these are things that naturally elicit fear and concern.
We also know that emotions have their origin in the brain. Without a God, people can still feel emotions. Without a brain, or at least without portions of their brains, they can't feel emotions. Chemicals can manipulate emotions. Someone feeling fear or anxiety can take a Xanax and be made to feel calm, even giddy.
There are unusual and unfortunate cases where people lose to some extent or another their emotions. And you could look at these people and see what happens to them. The classic case, the most famous case, is that of a man called Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage is the classic intro-psych example. Extremely poor guy, poor schnook. In 1848, he was a construction foreman. In 1848, he was working at a site with explosives and iron rods. And due to an explosion, an iron rod passed through his head like so. Imagine that rod shooting upwards. It went under his eye and popped out the top of his head. Amazingly, Gage was not killed. In fact, he was knocked unconscious only for a short period, and then he got up. When it was all said and done, he wasn't blind, he wasn't deaf, didn't lose language, didn't become aphasic, no paralysis, no retardation. In some sense, what happened was much worse. He lost his character. Here's a description at the time of what Gage was like. And this is from Damasio's excellent book, Descartes' Error. He used to be a really responsible guy, a family man, very reliable, very trustworthy. But after the accident, he was fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, manifesting but little deference for his fellows, impatient of restraint or advice, a child in his intellectual capacities and manifestations. He had the animal pleasures of a strong man. His foul language is so debased that women are advised not to stay long in his presence. And he couldn't hold a job. He lost his family, couldn't hold a job. He ended up in a circus. He was in a circus going around the country with his big iron rod, telling everybody the story as they surrounded and clapped.
Indeed, emotions aren't something mystical or divine. Even other biological creatures can manipulate another's emotions.
There's a parasite known as toxoplasmosis that lives in the bodies of rats. But it gets passed on when the rats get eaten by cats. And then it ends up in the cat's feces, and then it ends up back in rats. If you are a rat and you have toxoplasmosis, you are perfectly healthy, except for one thing. The toxoplasmosis rewires your brain, and it makes you less afraid of cats. Now, again, this is not some sort of bizarre quirk of a humorous God. Rather, it's because this is the adaptive strategy of the toxoplasmosis virus.
But here's something to note about the divinely inspired book from God, the supposed creator. The biblical writers give no clue that they knew emotions were seated in the brain. Instead, like most ancient peoples, the biblical authors believed emotions came from the heart. See, for example, statements made in Matthew 5:28 and John 14:1.
Think about self-awareness for just a moment. Humans are self-aware, but that's it. There is no animal that is self-aware.
Human beings are not the only animals possessing self-awareness. Research scientists have known for quite some time that other mammals like apes and dolphins possess a level of self-awareness, even avians like magpies.
Humans aren't the only ones aware of their own reflection. Birds can recognize themselves as well. Researchers have shown this for the first time by placing different colored dots on magpies' necks. The birds could only catch a glimpse of the stickers if they looked in a mirror. Here you can see a bird scratch its neck when it notices a brightly colored sticker. Some magpies tried to remove the sticker with their beaks, while others used their feet. Birds that were tagged with black spots that blended in with their feathers didn't react when they looked in the mirror. Magpies have bigger brains than other birds that allow for lots of connections between different brain areas. Researchers think this may explain why they can recognize themselves while other bird species may not be able to.
Science rules.
This 3-year-old chimpanzee has never seen a mirror before. He's not sure what to make of it. Erect fur is usually a sign of fear or anger. But his fear is soon replaced by curiosity. This chimp appears to know that that's her tongue and those are her teeth.
Chimpanzees seem to have a concept of the bodily self that allows them to look into a mirror and say, that image is equivalent to this body.
But how can we prove that humans and chimpanzees really identify the figure in the mirror as themselves? Psychologists have a well-known test for this. It's called the mark test. A researcher marks a child's cheek. The child then looks in a mirror. He moves his hand up to the mark. He recognizes himself. By the age of 2, half of all children tested can recognize themselves. Soon they all do. So, can our ape cousins pass this test? A keeper places a mark on a female orangutan. Next, they put her in front of a mirror. She has seen her reflection before, but this time she notices that something has changed. Her hand goes to the mark. All the great apes, gorillas, orangutans, chimps and bonobos can pass the mark test by a certain age. But we don't recognize just ourselves, we recognize other people too. Is this what separates us from the apes? At the Primate Research Institute in Japan, a chimp takes a voice recognition test. She's played a 1-second clip of a voice. She's then shown 2 photographs and has to identify the correct image from just hearing that short soundbite. First, she hears an ape sound, she recognizes the sound instantly and selects the right ape. Now she hears a human voice. She sees an ape and a human face and picks the human face. She seems to recognize the difference between ape and human sounds. Finally, she hears another human voice. But this time, she's shown 2 human faces. She selects the correct picture. From hearing just that 1-second clip, she can distinguish not just different ape voices, but different human voices too. This chimp has an 80% success rate for the test. So, what differences have we uncovered so far? We've tested both humans and apes and found that they recognize themselves. Both are self-aware. So far, there is little difference.
Also, morality. This is another non-physical human characteristic that points to an existence of God. Where did morality come from? Basic morality and a general sense of right and wrong permeate all humanity. What is the source?
Morality is certainly evolutionary and has its origin in our neurophysiology. Humankind is not the only biological entity to possess a form of morality.
Let a bunch of chimps into a yard filled with watermelons.
She's got 2 of them.
And while a few of them may hoard the fruit at first,
She's so greedy.
Oh, she's going to go for 3.
eventually they will share.
If she would sit on 3 watermelons and not share with anybody, I think that would be a revolt at some point.
Professor DeWall, a pioneer in the topic of animal empathy, says this is just one example of how animals display something approaching a moral sense. These pictures show chimps making up after a fight, hugging, reaching out a hand, kissing. Chimps will also mourn the loss of loved ones.
If one of the members of a group dies, the rest doesn't eat for a day. They're very silent, they don't eat.
DeWall also designed this experiment with capuchin monkeys, where this female gets a choice between a token that will result in just her getting a treat, or a token that results in both her and her friend getting treats.
Over time, if you do this often enough, the monkeys start to prefer the pro-social token.
Pro-social?
Yeah. So
meaning that it helps somebody else in their group?
Yes.
All of this has Professor DeWall posing a provocative question.
You're basically arguing that the building blocks of morality are present in our animal ancestors, and you're using that to raise the question, do we need religion?
Yeah. I'm not sure that religion is at the root of morality, because I personally think that morality probably existed long before we had religions.
If there is no God, if there is no divine system of morality, who defines right or wrong?
I don't think we need God for that.
He says we evolved to be moral, that humans, like primates, are group animals, and that groups that work well together tend to survive longer.
Well, I'm very interested in the origin of morality, and there is a school within philosophy who believes that, maybe you could call it the Kantian school, which believes that we developed morality on a sort of rational basis. We decided one day to have this rule or that rule because this one was more just than that one, and so on. And so it's a rational process. There's a different school within philosophy, which is the Humean school, David Hume, who believes that morality grew out of the moral sentiments, like empathy and sympathy and retribution and reciprocity. We have a lot of these sentiments, as Hume called them, which drove us towards a moral system. And I believe very strongly in the Humean school, in believing that actually it came out of our psychology, and our psychology is a primate psychology. And so in primates you can see many of these same tendencies. You can see empathy and sympathy, you see reciprocity, you see retribution, you see rules that are enforced and they beat up someone who doesn't follow the rules. And so you see many of these elements that are present in human morality. I'm not sure that they're moral beings in that they reason about these things or that they build a consensus about these things. I'm not sure that they're doing that. But they have many of this psychology that we have incorporated in human morality.
And of course, remember this, all of humanity has a desire to seek out some form of spiritual connection. Have you noticed this? What is the source of this spiritual homing device that virtually all humans seem to have?
I don't know if you've caught a theme yet in all my responses to Dutko's assertions, but it should be obvious by now what the answer is to his recognition that most humans across cultures possess some form of superstition. This discussion could go on and on. The field is so rich with study, but the bottom line here is that apologists like Dutko don't want to do any work researching the mysteries of being human. If the question is complex, instead of engaging their brains, they'd rather say God did it and be finished with the intellectual quest. But again, as stated before, that is not the path to knowledge. It's a retreat into superstition and does nothing to advance humankind. and that sort of intellectual cowardice does nothing to convince the skeptic of God's existence, no matter how much one charges for the privilege of hearing such vacuous assertions.